Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Digital Literacy series from the Centre for Legal Innovation, the Automation mini-series. We had a wonderful reception to our first episode, so I really can't wait for this one to kick off. We're here today with our hosts, Mark Tyndall, who's the VP of Markets and Growth in the Asia Pacific region for nocode. Hi, Mark, good to see you. And also joining him today is Jean Turner, who is the Managing Director of Lawhawk, and you can see their amazing logos there. We're going to be talking about, in this episode, using legal automation to solve the bigger business problems. And with a huge, huge welcome and thank you to kick us off, welcome to Mark and Jean. And I'll go away now and hand it all over to you.
Thank you, Terry. It's very kind of you. And thank you for Centre for Legal Innovation and the whole team for having us today. Jean and I are pretty excited to be here, of course. We might just introduce ourselves quickly, get that out of the way. I'm Mark Tyndall. I'm from nocode, as Terry said. If you don't know nocode already, we're the leading no-code platform for legal and risk and compliance and procurement teams who delivering what I think are the most exciting and sophisticated automation solutions in the market. So we're a global company. We have a sensational team here in Melbourne helping our Asia Pacific and global customers with things like legal and business process automation, contract lifecycle management solutions. So that's sophisticated contract generation, contract management, and the automation of expertise and risk and other reasoning tools that allow you to scale your subject matter expertise to make it available to your business or your customers 24/7. And my job day to day is to help you to identify whether these types of capabilities are a good fit for what you are trying to achieve as a legal or procurement risk compliance professional. And I'm very lucky to be able to work with Jean Turner from Lawhawk to do these types of things. Jean, I'm pretty excited that we're sharing one of our often one-on-one conversations, but more openly here today with the Centre for Legal Innovation and our wonderful webinar audience. Over to you, Jean, to introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. This will be a slightly more structured version of kind of one of many conversations that Mark and I have had about lots of different things. So, I'm Jean, Managing Director of Lawhawk, and Lawhawk's basically a legal automation consultancy. And what we do is work alongside our customers to look at their situation, try and figure out what problems it is they're trying to solve, work out what options might be available and which ones might be a good fit for them. And then sort of be able to work alongside them and other partners and people that are involved to design and build and support solutions that will actually work to deliver the outcomes that they're looking for. So that's pretty much what we do. So I think, Mark, I'm going to kick it off with a little bit of kind of context here. So, look, I've been working on automation projects for pretty much over 20 years. I first started in a bank where somebody helped me automate some loan documents, and I just immediately got it and thought this is what we should be doing more of. And last 5 years with Lawhawk, that's pretty much exclusively what we've done, is working on how to automate legal documents and processes. But one thing that really becomes clear as you get into this sort of stuff is that legal automation isn't just about documents, and it's not just about legal documents for lawyers. It really all has to sort of be part of a bigger picture, and I suppose that's what we're going to talk about, is that how this all can lead through to generating bigger business benefits.
So in that context, and thanks, Jean, that's a fantastic setting the scene context for what we will talk about today. What are we going to talk about today? We want you to essentially look past the obvious and immediate headaches that you might be experiencing as a legal team, and importantly, to look at the broader process. We want you to identify the business outcomes that need to be achieved rather than just the immediate headache you might be experiencing. And we're going to talk to you about how legal automation can link up multiple processes right across, kind of even outside, but within, through an organization, and go to some of that broader range of benefits, I guess, to help you deliver some really great outcomes. And it's using technology like data-enabled workflow expertise and document automation technology. And when we talk about this today, we'll be talking about things like business process model notation, BPMN. So in short, taking a process-oriented approach to solving some of these bigger business problems. These types of things are, of course, very close to my and Jean's hearts.
And at one level, like this is going to seem like it's most relevant for in-house legal teams, because I guess just in the nature of what in-house teams do, you're closer to your business customers and you can see the business processes and kind of how everything can fit together. But I think this should be really useful for law firms as well, because I think it firstly shows you some of the stuff that your clients are either doing or interested in, but also kind of how you can fit into this much more joined up world now. So you can actually become part of your clients' business processes as well in ways that just were never possible before.
So, okay, where do we start? Jean, we talked about the types of chats that we have pretty regularly, one-on-one, we get to share them today, but I get the sense that you talk to a lot of corporate legal departments too, and I get the sense that there's a pretty common pattern of requests, queries that you get that I think help us to get started with our discussion today.
Yeah, absolutely. I think whether it's in-house teams or law firms, it's pretty common when people initially come to us, they've got some particular document in mind that they want to look at getting automated. And so, that's where the conversation will often start. And often they'll be looking at it from their own perspective, because they'll be the people that are drafting that document right now. And so they've got the pain point. And so they'll be thinking about how they can reduce that pain point for them. They're not at that stage and really looking for like the broader opportunities as part of the bigger process when we first start talking to them.
And we often hear that too. We hear legal teams saying we're the provider of legal services. We might provide those legal services to a procurement function, to the business more broadly. And they might say, well, this procurement related contract is causing the legal team a series of headaches, and we need to avoid, otherwise resolve those legal headaches relating to this document. So let's automate it. Now, it's a great starting point, automation. As you see here on the screen, we can go through this process in a pretty streamlined way to get a document ready. But to get ready for what? Like, what are we actually doing here? It's self-service. It's saying to business users, well, while we have traditionally been the providers of this deliverable, this artifact, this contract, it's actually something that the business now can generate themselves directly using automation. So, still, at a relatively high level, we're moving from the idea of lawyers doing all of this through to a self-service model where business users can do it themselves, but in a very similar way to how you provided it before. Following rules, following logic. But what we're doing here as a core starting point is looking for those self-service opportunities as a starting point to broadening out the value that you deliver into the business.
And of course, that's like a really natural place to start, isn't it, Mark? I mean, you and I both came out of working in law firms, and kind of, you naturally will start with what you know best and kind of, the parts you understand. So, when I worked in a firm, I was a corporate and finance lawyer. I came into this looking at loan documents, security documents, share sale agreements, things like that. But it's as you get into it further that you kind of really start to see that context and how everything sort of starts to fit together. And, you realize that businesses, they have documents and they have processes well before and well after the contracting stage. And then you start thinking, okay, well, so how do we actually join all this stuff up? Because that's where the opportunities for the real value creation often will lie.
So I guess our point here up front is to tell you to follow your instinct when you're thinking about streamlining and automating what you currently do. Do follow your instinct. Try something practical, get started, learn by doing, iterate, gather data, and improve from there. But the approach we're trying to encourage today, and we're about to dive into further, is to also keep your eyes on the broader set of opportunities in and around your services or your existing services that you sometimes won't spot or tackle or prioritize until much later down the track.
So the example we've looked at so far really is it is focused on a contract, right? Drafting a contract, and that looks like it's the key action. But really, when you sort of step back, you think, well, the contract is only a part of the organisation actually trying to do something. And in any step in a process, you really want to be sort of looking at sort of what value that step is adding, and do we need it? So I think there's an opportunity, even at this stage, to take a look and say, well, do we even need to have a contract for to achieve the outcome that we're seeking? So it might be that we've already got a contract in place and we just need to make sure that we find that and confirm that it covers what we need to do. Or quite possibly the contract value here, it might be so low, the transaction value is so low that we don't actually need to document it in a formal complex contract. We could just have a purchase order. And if we don't need to have a contract, then obviously we're going to take a lot of time out from the organisation in terms of having to draft it, to negotiate it, manage that process, and also the supplier as well. And we can get straight on to what we're really trying to do, which is delivery of the goods or services or whatever it is the organisation's really trying to achieve.
So how do we practically make sure that we're taking this into account, what Jean's saying? We want you to start thinking about it as a process. Let's take a process lens. And what we suggest that you do at this early stage is that you broaden your view of what can be achieved. Start looking at the bigger processes, so they're legal and non-legal processes that you participate in, and literally start zooming out. So where we've had this contract as a deliverable, as an artifact that you would create and hand over, provide as a service, we're kind of zooming out to look into this broader process. Maybe a question of, is a contract even really required? So the example here is, well, what does the business user, when they come to you asking for a goods and services agreement, say? Do they need that contract? Do they always know how to decide whether they need a contract? Are they talking to procurement? We're hearing this feedback pretty consistently that the challenge for legal teams is they're fielding these 20 or 30-minute phone calls to kind of triage these requirements and answer these questions. Tell me about the sourcing activity or the transaction. Let's apply the rules here on the phone. Now, applying those rules is really important. It's your job, but you can actually map those rules and apply them at scale. So do you need a contract? You can take the approach of, mapping, codifying the rules to scale them out to the business. They can self-serve to answer these types of questions. So working through whatever the parameters might be specific to your team and your organization, transaction values, the business rules that drive whether they need certain approvals, how it works under your DOA, under your delegations of authority. But mapping these out yourselves essentially to streamline the answering of these questions without having to have that 20 or 30-minute phone call. So you can see here the mapping of some basic rules to determine that when we have a certain level of complexity and a certain transaction size and whatever other parameters you might be working with in your business, you can triage that to determine whether a contract is required. Okay, so once we map those types of rules, what does it look like? Well, you get this experience of running an application. Again, we're in the self-service world where people can now fill in these parameters themselves. And having zoomed out, looked at the question, is a contract even required in this case, not just the generation of it, we can get some guidance to the user directly saying, based on the complexity of the transaction, procurement, sourcing activity you're engaged in, business user, it looks like you will require one. So I guess there's a mini recap so far. We've only had to take a slightly broader view of what we thought was the problem, a painful production of a contract, to start getting a hint at the broader value streams running into through a business. But we're still pretty zoomed in on a particular piece of a process. But hopefully we've shown, even if very quickly, the value of looking at or more broadly, or zooming out on the opportunities that you might be keen to tackle and the value that they can create.
Oh, that looks really great, Mark. So I think what we can do from here is we can sort of extend this kind of logic a little bit further and say, well, what other steps might there be in an overall contracting process that we might also want to look at? So, what are some of the things that frequently come up that cause delays and costs and you might want to strip out? So a common one that regularly comes up is just that process of having to sort of review and approve like a document. And there'll be lots of different stakeholders in an organisation that might all need to be brought in, sometimes always, sometimes only if certain criteria are met. But, thinking about things like your tax team, legal, IT security, for instance, procurement people. So they will often need to be involved often they'll be brought in very late in the process, so they'll feel like they've kind of already been brought in when it's too late. Everything's been decided and they're just being asked to approve it so that it can be signed. So that's frustrating for them as well. But if they're only being brought in then, and perhaps they're being brought in one at a time, then it's very hard to see what if someone wants to make changes? You have to go back around everybody, and it can all get pretty torturous, right? So, Mark, what can people do in those sort of situations?
I'm glad you asked, Jane, because it's a common conversation that I have with corporate legal teams and particularly procurement teams. And the solution here is zooming out to look at this broader business process. And these can turn into some pretty sophisticated processes. The one you can see on the screen here can look a bit complex, but really what this is, again, in the BPMN world, the business model process notation world, is what we call a parallel workflow or a parallel approval. So what you're doing is streamlining the engagement, starting with, say, a business user generating a contract, but allowing potentially when changes are made by a supplier, by a counterparty, that those changes can be reviewed and approved by those various governance teams in parallel. So rather than this linear process of step 1, legal review, step 2, tax review, step 3, procurement sign off, we can actually run these processes in parallel, noting that we've zoomed out, mapped, understood, agreed that process, but we've also got the tools now to facilitate that type of parallel operation. So that type of concurrent work, that's just one example of, again, zooming out to get people involved, get them involved early, and take that manual work of the email exchange out of the equation.
And one thing that I found really interesting when I was looking at that canvas, Mark, which we discussed, was, and in this case, it's very clear then to see like where the approvals actually come in. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. So the approvals are only brought into the mix if the supplier has requested changes. But you could look at it and at any time, I suppose, be able to say, well, is that process working well? And what if the people that are drafting the contract, if they're not drafting well? For instance, they might just be taking a supplier's proposal and dumping all of the, like what the supplier said they're going to do, just setting that out as the description of the services, and so it's not particularly tight or robust. You could look at that and say, all right, well, we want to make some changes to the way that we're managing this process so that we're happy that it's a good contract before it goes to the supplier. And Mark, I guess what you can easily see in an automated tool like this is how you could just change where those nodes are and sort of say, right, well, we'll shift at least some of these reviews further forward in the process so they could happen before it goes to the supplier.
And this is exactly right, Jane. And it's a takeaway, I think, from this whole CLI series, that using no-code tools allows you to be very nimble for subject matter experts, for lawyers or procurement professionals to be actually updating, changing these BPMN workflows themselves. So it's not a question. They can do this themselves. They can actually work with these types of workflows, make changes, update them based on their subject matter expertise. You're not waiting on IT teams to make these changes. And that's the power, the beauty of no-code automation that this whole series is about.
Awesome. So another step in the process that also creates challenges is like when you're drafting the clause, the contract, and you have to work out like which clauses you should be including, right? I mean, you can have lots of different clauses that might not be included at all, or you could have like just within limitations of liability or IP ownership, you could have several clauses, and there'll be different options for different reasons. And lawyers find it hard even to work out which one to use, or just annoying if you've got 5 different versions and you've got to delete 4 every time just to get the one that you want, which again drives some bad behavior, which is to just stop using the precedent and save as over something else. So there's all sorts of challenges that come from not having good answers to this. Or it might be you draft the contract and it's got the clause that you typically would want, but you've taken quite an aggressive position on liability or IP, and so the other party, when they push back, again, how do we know then what our fallback should be, and how do we make sure that gets in? And plenty of legal teams have challenges with that. Reviewing a clause that somebody's just made up or copied and pasted from another document or scraped off Google, all that good fun stuff again at the last minute. And so there's probably better ways to be able to manage that as well.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. It's often a bit, Gene, that I think is left out of this broader, process equation when people are zooming out to think about what sits around their processes, going to the knowledge content side, going to the management of it, not just the management of it, but as you say, the generation of it, where it's being scraped from, who's drafting it, and how that comes to be in a contract with your name on it. Zooming out on this, if you're thinking about it from a process perspective, you can plug in tools essentially that allow you to maintain this knowledge content in a very structured way. We talk about the idea of clause libraries, clause banks, but essentially a central repository of knowledge content of drafting that allows you to add, edit, tag up, provide guidance on different clauses. You can kind of augment this to essentially allow you to do playbook automation so that people are getting guidance, even having rules or guide rails put in place for them for a given contract with the clause content, with the drafting that's appropriate for their circumstances. And that as a legal team, you know that you're comfortable with. The risk envelope is right for this already agreed drafting. So the beauty of that, of course, is that when someone goes, again, back into this self-service kind of contracting space, they can draw on this knowledge content, this structured data, essentially, in a very streamlined way, and put this drafting into a contract in a very predictable way, in a risk-adjusted way, but also in a way that's auditable. You've got a very clear trail of how decisions were made and how this content got into one of your kind of key contracts. So you can see it here exported or, dropped into this contract, and we've got a limitations of liability, which we'll see pop up in another example in a moment.
Great. So I guess you've got the perfect contract draft. You've sent it out to the other party, and then you get into the negotiation phase, and that's also another area which can literally add weeks to the process, because you could have multiple different people that are involved. I mean, I guess you've got your internal kind of processes to when people need to review changes and comment on them, but the external parties as well. So everybody's working out of Outlook and different versions of Word, and they're redlining different versions, and so it can quickly become a mess where you're quite likely to be working off different versions to what other people are, and then somebody's got to find a way to bring all that back together in a coherent way where where you can sort of consolidate and reach your final agreement. So what would you do in that space, Mark?
Well, it's a really interesting one. I think Negotiation Gene is a great example of where there are a bunch of different tools, and you can kind of see here, again, this kind of BPMN, this workflow, very business process focused approach to how to negotiate a contract. Now, technically, from a process perspective and with the actual tools you've got, there's a lot that can be done. You can do this type of redlining on a platform. You can be commenting, keeping all of this negotiation, redlining activity, for example, the back and forth, streamlined on a platform, stored in a database with an audit trail, which is really rich, powerful, allows you to see precisely what's gone on, who made changes where, how a document came to be, how it is. But there's another core bit of this equation of understanding this through a process lens, I think. And I think it's zooming out to look at the experience of your suppliers or counterparties or whoever they might be, depending on what the contract is and the service you're delivering to the business. And that's to ensure that people feel empowered in the right way to negotiate an outcome that you are aiming for too, and that aligns with your corporate values. I do hear of examples sometimes with negotiation workflows and things that are locked down in a specific way that don't actually allow a supplier to kind of express their position in the way that they need to communicate to you the value that you're going to generate together and what this contract is truly for. So I guess my point here is to say there are a whole range of tools you could use to keep negotiation really streamlined, to keep that audit trail, and just to make that version control problem, go away. But it's important to be very intentional about how you design those and how you empower your business users, governance teams, tax, legal, IT, whoever it might be, to do their jobs and deliver the value that they deliver best. So you can see one example of that here, and there's many, many ways of doing it on a technical front. And that might be clause by clause negotiation, where you expose just bits and pieces of an agreement to a supplier, or it might be that you do it in the vision you see here, which is a true redlining experience tracked and audited with a system.
Great. So the last thing that we're going to look at in terms of this kind of contracting process is once we've got our final contract version agreed, there's still the process of actually getting it signed. And like we all know how hard that can be at times, because you might have multiple parties to the transaction. Some of them are signing some documents, some are signing others. You've got multiple people might be signing for each party, depending on sort of the type they are. And they literally could be located anywhere, and you end up kind of compiling all these emails with different documents going to different people, and you're sending them out, and then you have to chase people up multiple times, asking them if they got the email and would they kindly sign and return the documents. And so eventually they'll all come back in. Someone's going to have to compile the whole lot together, scan it all again, turn it into some really hideous kind of composite document by this stage, and then send it back out to everybody and hope that it actually gets saved where it should do. I guess you've also got the problem that everybody might be saving it, so then you've got multiple copies of the same document being saved in the same place. So it's just it's a mess, and yeah, it's really common for copies of contract documents to be lost and not able to be found at the times that they're actually needed. So Mark, do you want to talk to us about the processes for arranging signing of documents?
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, a lot of it, I think, will be familiar to many of you, and you will have been involved pretty, intensely with e-signature tools before. It might be things like DocuSign, OneSpan Sign, or Adobe Sign. And they're incredibly powerful. You'll be across all of the kind of execution requirements, and particularly in our current environment, the provisions in Australia, for example, that have changed over the past year or two in terms of the proper execution of agreements and deeds, and how electronic signatures fit into that. So this is another example of where the tools are really powerful. Technically you can deliver a really streamlined experience of, as we said, we've zoomed out on the process. We're not just generating a contract. We're not just dealing with approvals, streamlining how that content is generated, agreed, negotiated, but also how it's signed. And the opportunity really here in this kind of broader business opportunity is to streamline all these intersections of process and technology where people have had friction before. And you will have experienced this before. It's where people are negotiating a contract offline or by email, and there's a process of version control and uploading to DocuSign, say, to get it executed. It runs through a workflow. You take that executed document out and put it into your document management system or your matter management system. There are ways of streamlining that, which can take a lot of the pain out of that for the business user and for the counterparty, for the supplier, whoever it might be. And that just involves design on your part, really thinking through where the pain points are arising, where people are getting frustrated, and also dropping the ball a little bit, being able to see that where people aren't filing documents appropriately, or they're not executing them properly, or they've used the wrong signature blocks, executed in the wrong capacity, things like that. So what you're doing is de-risking a process, but also streamlining that process. So it just takes the thought and the effort out of getting that document signed and into the right place. And you can see an example of that on the screen here, where it's a pretty streamlined process to get that signed end to end.
Great. So what we'll do now is this is a good time for a bit of a recap. And as you can see from what we've just covered, that you can pretty much systematically work your way through the process as you sort of surface all the different parts of it and work out where there are opportunities for the improvement. And that way you're not just like fixing one bottleneck and shifting it straight on to the next one. Over time, you're going to sort of remove all of the bottlenecks, and that's where you can really unlock a lot of the overall time savings. So just as one example, we completed a project earlier this year with a customer of ours in the construction space, and they do a lot of subcontracts. And so our original idea was that we were just going to focus on their subcontract document and how we could streamline the preparation of that. And there was some cool stuff, looking up details of the contractors and various other information they would already hold. And we were pretty confident that was going to save quite a lot of time in the drafting. What we found in practice was that it actually streamlined the entire process when it was paired up with digital signing and the ability for them to review the contract, not as a document, but pretty much on screen with their subcontractors, because they could kind of go through on screen in a very structured way, and the subcontractor could see exactly what they were being asked to do, and it was all kind of clear how it all fitted together. And so at the end of the meeting, they could sort of say, well, we all agreed on this, and the subcontractor say yes. In the past, that's when they would actually draft the document, send it out to the subcontractor, who would probably then sort of think about it a bit more, maybe get their lawyers involved. And they said it would be 4 to 10 weeks on average for subcontract to actually get finalised. And there was knock-on effects from that, because the subcontractor wouldn't order any materials until they actually had a contract, and that could mean that the actual project timeframes were put at risk and cost of materials could change. So it's quite a big problem. But when they do it all in the room and the contractor says, yep, I'm good with everything, they can send it straight to them on their phone. They can sign on their phone and walk out of the room happy that the contract was what they all agreed. They've got their subcontract. They can go away and order everything. And what used to take between 4 and 10 weeks actually turned out to be an hour or less sometimes. So those are the sort of like business outcomes that you can get from this stuff. And it's not like it's sort of each individual part in its own is kind of worth so much time savings. It's more like the combination of the whole lot together. Suddenly 1 and 1 equals 10.
And I think that's a super powerful example, Jane. I really like this example because it sounds like a bit of a dream world, right? You said 4 to 10 weeks down to 1 hour. And I think people can sometimes think, yeah, it's due to the technology, or it's due to how the technology's been linked together. That's facilitated that, sure. But a really powerful aspect of streamlining it using technology and going through that process is that you have that agreement and understanding between a legal team that would otherwise review and sign off on that contract or need to. And I think we all kind of know this from experience, but when that person in the room talking to the supplier emails you the contract to review, by very nature of sending it through to your team, to the legal team, there's work to be done. There's a review that needs to be undertaken, even though it might be a readily agreeable position or situation that you've been in many times before. So having worked with the legal team, between the procurement team and these business users, to kind of streamline, understand the positions that can be taken, the risk envelope that's totally acceptable, people can do that in the room. And we don't have to then prompt our other teams to go about the work. I don't want to call it busy work, because value still can be added in that additional review or request for advice. But in many cases, we already know the risk envelope that we can operate in, and we can, in this case, agree it and do it in an hour. So I think it's a really powerful example.
Great. Okay, so before we move on to the next section, then, just in terms of sort of some suggested steps, Mark and I are both on the same page on this. Is you really, before you dive into anything, you want to sort of like just go back, look at that process. It doesn't matter whether you're doing an NDA or a goods and service agreement or kind of working with the procurement team. Just got to not focus on one pain point, but look at the whole thing. Go back, look at where does the process begin? Where is the first touch point? Where does the customer actually kind of first get in contact with the organisation? Because maybe that's where we can actually go right back to the very beginning and make it super easy for the customer to be able to get what they want from the organisation in quite a different way. And then how far does it actually carry on through? Like, what are the steps after the legal team's been involved? How do we make sure that this contract actually delivers the benefits that the organisation is wanting from it, and kind of how far can we go with that? So what parts are working well, like where are you finding that that you're getting the best feedback, and then where are the parts that people are saying that this could be better? Maybe those areas of frustration are some really good places to start. And you can draw it all out. You can use tools like Neurologic or Checkbox or some of the other automation tools that are available. Just put it on paper. Doesn't really matter. Just get it down and then work out where you want to start. Start small. You definitely don't want to try and bite the elephant off and eat the elephant in one bite. It's like do little bits, but in the context of where you ultimately want to get to, and just make steady progress, because you'll start to get the experience of the feedback, the data, what's working. You can make adjustments as you go, and you'll get there in a way that sort of the whole thing will be very different to where you're currently at.
Good recap, Gene. That was I think a really useful checkpoint. And good to have a checkpoint, because we're going to have a change of tack. We've talked pretty much exclusively about contracts, contract lifecycle management, the idea of looking at a broader business problem and the opportunities throughout the business adjacent to what we traditionally deliver, but in the context of contracts, contract lifecycle management. We're going to look at regulation now. And we raise that because in addition to contracts and many other domains, it's absolutely phenomenal what our corporate and law firm teams are dealing with now on the regulatory side, and the demands, particularly on corporate legal teams, to help to mitigate and manage regulatory risk is extraordinary. And including in Australia and New Zealand and in Singapore, even in the coming 6 months, 1 year, there is a large wave of new regulation coming, which is confronting and very significant.
Absolutely. I just think this is a massive opportunity for in-house teams to look at kind of how they're currently managing these types of things and different ways of doing it, because again, it all comes back to kind of the business process and the objectives that they're trying to meet. So of course, you're still going to have to go through and do the underlying analysis of what the new regulations say and then what they mean in the context of your organization. But instead of kind of passing that back to the business as a detailed memo or like an A3 spreadsheet with hundreds of rows and kind of that's an inch thick, which somebody then has to try and interpret, you can actually build all of that analysis and logic into a tool that the business users can actually use when doing the work. And that's just a completely different proposition in terms of you're not only then setting them up so that they're going to be compliant because they're using a tool which will mean that they can only do it in a compliant way, but you're also actually enabling them to do what they need to do in an incredibly efficient way, and it's going to be great for them, great for the other parties you're dealing with. So I just think it's a really great opportunity.
And we're constantly encountering these challenges in the financial services domain, of course, in other regulated industries as well. But it's things like responsible lending, design and distribution obligations, DDO, breach reporting are just a few. So breach reporting when we get to the point you're in, when things don't go as well as we'd hoped. And that's complex. It involves ensuring that teams throughout the business, again, taking this high-level view, that teams across the business are collecting all that information from customers, say, ensuring that they can evidence that they undertook the right inquiries, the correct application of benchmarks, applying standards like fairness and reasonableness. And obviously, as you know, all of these considerations are underpinned by really substantial policy and process within your organization, which is very easy to confuse and very regularly confused. So if you're currently not using automated solutions to kind of collect up and organize that data, say out of credit files or application forms, wherever it comes from, this is already a nightmare for your teams, probably, and teams throughout the business, and often for the customer. So if they haven't had a terrible experience filling in the forms, if they have kind of provided information in a structured way, and you've already got that information sitting there, you can do really powerful things with it.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is it also gives you that comfort that, as well as kind of you've got people working and using the tool and it's going well, and they're compliant sort of by default through that. The regulators are going to want to know what you're doing to ensure compliance as well. And so I guess, typically you'll have, training that you will have run, you'll have sort of surveys that you'll send out periodically to check that people are compliant, that sort of stuff. But it's all quite reactive, I suppose. Whereas, when you've got an automated system, you can actually show, like, this is how it works. This is the process that people are following every single time. And, you can have dashboards that would actually display, these are all of the processes that have been run, and these are all of the ones that have gone through, and this is how we dealt with any kind of ones that raised issues. And so it's not actually being compliant, it's being seen to be compliant as well, which is really important. And then even if something does go wrong, like, I think it's as well, you've got that more real time, you've got data that's going to help. So, if you've made a mistake, hopefully that's going to come up a lot more quickly. And all the research is that if you make a mistake and the customer's unhappy, if you fix it really quickly, their loyalty and happiness actually goes up. Like they appreciate that you resolved it. Whereas if you don't know about it for 6 months, well, they disappear. They don't, they're no longer a customer, and they will have told at least 10 other people how unhappy they are. So, just the real-time visibility that you get around kind of what's actually happening and the ability to step in is invaluable. And if you've really got it wrong somehow, if your underlying analysis or logic was wrong and you've got sort of a systemic issue, firstly, that's going to show up a lot more quickly as well, I would think, because you're going to get consistency in the way that things are being dealt with. So you should see it. And it's going to be a lot easier to get in there and remediate it, because you're going to more easily be able to see exactly who's been affected and how and what you need to do to remedy it. So I think there's the opportunity is firstly to do the process better and to not screw it up, but also to make sure that if there are issues, you'd also be able to deal with them a lot more effectively.
A big part of this, Gene, I think, is engagement with the regulator, which people are now looking to streamline as well. So again, things going well, auditability, things are trackable, reportable. But when things do go wrong, you can actually streamline those interactions that allow you to meet your obligations, say, under the breach reporting regime under the Corporations Act or something like that. And people are more and more saying, we will deal with the volume of this work, the decision-making and the complexity of decision-making and the collaboration between teams in that decision-making process using a workflow and decision-making tool, a digital tool. And people are getting some really great outcomes doing that, streamlining that operation. And it extends through to traceability and knowing that you're meeting your deadlines. And we've kind of seen examples over the past few years of where that hasn't gone well and the types of consequences that can give rise to.
Cool. So I think one thing that would be good to touch on now, and that comes up really regularly, particularly those that are watching from an in-house perspective will know that, sometimes when you're sort of looking at these problems and you kind of have a feeling that you want to be able to improve it. But the question is, do we need a legal tech tool, if you like, to address this, or is there something else within the organisation already that we could use? And that comes up quite often, because maybe there's a view that we could get the same results using something else. And I think I would say in that scenario, there's a few things to consider. So the first one, I think, is that kind of so we talk about legal tech tools. Like, I think these platforms have come a long way in a very short space of time, and they're actually very capable of doing a much broader range of things than just the legal stuff that maybe we originally started thinking about. So, they all have strengths in different areas, but things like workflow, expertise, automation, risk analysis, and document creation are things that they can do really strongly, and they can be integrated with other tools. So another key point is that a lot of these other tools, they were originally designed for other things, which they do incredibly well, but they don't necessarily do the things that lawyers need to do. And document creation would be one really good example where I just don't see many of those more general tools that really have any strength at all in document creation. And if you're looking at kind of how you're going to use another tool for some of these things, I'd really take a close look at what they can do in terms of generating documents. And Mark showed an example of at the very beginning of like what I guess a more specialist automation tool can do when creating documents. And not all systems have anywhere near that kind of capability. And so using a more specialist solution can help plug gaps in the overall technology stack. And then the other thing is that the software is only a part of the overall solution, right? So, you need the subject matter expertise. You've got to actually take the understanding of the regulations or the legal process, and you have to build that into the workflow. And I think what you could see in some of the examples that were on screen that Mark was showing is that, with a drag and drop, no code type situation, lawyers can actually do a lot of that themselves. We looked at where the approvals process might come in. You really would be able to just drag like the approvals process and connect it up at an earlier stage of process and sort of move things that quickly. So as soon as you get into a situation where as a lawyer and subject matter expert, you have to try and start translating what you think you want to an IT person who has no idea what you're talking about, and you don't really understand what their the sort of system does either, you end up with this mismatch where they don't understand what you're wanting, what they give you is not what you think you asked for, and it becomes like quite a repetitive, time-consuming process. So I think the stuff that Mark's shown and what I think the legal automation tools are doing in general, which is empowering the citizen developer, if you like, is really powerful, because it just reduces that whole time to get something sketched out and then into sort of a situation where you can actually see how it will work and refined and then continually adapted. So for me, those would be some of the key things that kind of, I guess, I would be thinking about if you're looking at some of these processes and thinking, right, how do we do something like that?
Yeah, and I like that, Gene, and take it into another domain too, where, we've talked about a few different concepts here, which we haven't really explained. And I talk about BPMN a lot, business process model and notation. And you can see on the screen that type of BPMN mindset approach standard that is used here to not only map and understand process, but execute and support process. And I think the challenge, the mantle for us to take up as lawyers is to dive into these domains that were sometimes exclusively the domain of the process engineer or the business analyst, and do that in support of a much better client experience. Now, it's not for everyone. Everyone's kind of not going to charge into BPMN or service design or systems thinking or lean head first, but identify where, and there are so many opportunities where you can dive into a bit of self-directed learning. There's so many MOOCs and other courses and reading online to dive into these concepts, to actually think about business problems in a way that absolutely crack open what was traditionally the legal service that you've been delivering. It means that those different schools of thought, which are now really permeating the legal sphere, legal teams, are able to help us deliver all this other value that we probably never quite imagined possible through the lens of our traditional kind of way of practicing. Okay, so that is largely what we wanted to cover, and we wanted to check in with the audience to see if there are any questions arising. I'm going to stop my screen share here. I thought I'd jump in with a question first, and Terry has come off mute. I can see Terry as well, but maybe to start us off, and if Terry might have a question, but I'll jump in with one first. I'll just beat everyone to the punch. Can you help us, Gene, understand when corporate legal teams are under this kind of repeated immense pressure to kind of demonstrate some quick wins? People talk about quick wins, got to get some quick wins. When it comes to this type of improvement exercise, how should we balance that when people are pushing for the quick wins against the approach that we've been talking about, which is to look more broadly at the related business problem? Doesn't that just make life more complicated and stops us getting the quick win?
Yeah, there's always going to be a bit of a balance there, isn't there? Because you do need to get some quick wins, both for your own morale and to give people confidence that this is actually working and is going to work. So I think you sort of, having mapped it out, I mean, you may well start with the document or whatever it was that first kind of brought you to it. I mean, you might as well do something that's going to give you some benefit as well in the first instance. But I think you do that in the context of knowing that bigger picture, and that kind of, if we do this and it works as well as I know that it will because I've really thought about it, then we're going to be able to do the next thing as well and not have to sort of take a step back to go forward. So I would still perhaps do that thing which like you had in mind, but you'll find it easier to get engagement as well, I think, from some of the other stakeholders if you can show that this isn't just about fixing a problem for the legal team, but it's actually got a bigger overall joined up benefit for the business. And so the investment that you're making now is actually kind of like, this is almost like the proof of concept, isn't it? The validation that this is going to work, and then we can extend it out. So balance it, but keep that bigger picture in mind so people are aware that this is actually an important thing for them to help you with.
And you mentioned before the concept of eating the elephant, but I think we can emphasize even one more time that we're not saying don't start small. We're not saying you've got to boil the ocean and look broad and try and solve every problem adjacent to what the service you've always delivered, if it's in the contract space or it's regulatory related, contentious regulatory related work. But just to focus on the burning and really high return problems to solve, knowing ahead of the game, ahead of time, that you have zoomed out, looked at the broader landscape, and that you've picked the problems and you've picked and identified the solutions that will create some value throughout the business, that you are getting the value stream running through your team and out into other teams when you otherwise might not have. Are there no other questions have come through? Terry, I don't know if any of this has intrigued you and you'd ask Jean or I a question, but we're very appreciative of the opportunity to present today and talk with CLI in this great mini-series. We've got our contact details up on the screen here. These are mine. Please reach out, connect on LinkedIn today. Like, why, as you're watching this, tell us what you like or what you didn't like, what things kind of resonated or what you would add to this, and we'd be really keen to chat about it with you more directly or on LinkedIn or in these wonderful CLI forums that Terry and the team create for us.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark and Jean. Really, really appreciated your time today. And thank you everyone who attended as well. Look, I just thought it was a fascinating presentation and you know, things that really jumped out to me, and I'm going to paraphrase it, but you know, starting with the end in mind. And I guess that's really important so that the projects that you're working on become part of a whole versus disjointed. And I guess I imagine that that's sometimes a problem, isn't it? That people just jump in, but they don't kind of look at the broader picture. But the other one I just, you know, that I'm so glad that you raised of many of the amazing points was that, you know, I actually think that the whole reg tech compliance and risk management conglomeration is actually on the cusp of an explosion at this point in time. And I actually think, you know, even perhaps slightly beyond what you were talking about, but certainly with reference to it, I think we're a hair's breadth away from, you know, automated compliance reporting to government and agencies. So if you're not doing the sort of stuff that you're talking about, gosh, that's going to be an amazing gap for you to try and bridge or get your head around. So I agree, just huge opportunities there. So there is so much to talk about and so much to follow up on. So folks, I just want to underscore what Mark said. Please find them at their respective places, and these contact details will obviously be available in the recording and with the podcast. So please do jump in and have a chat with them, because it would be, I'm sure, very much appreciated. We've got just a couple of questions and we've got a couple of minutes. So if I may, I'm going to address them to you, and either of you, please feel free to jump in. So the first question is, brilliant presentation. Yes, we agree with that. How is the software priced per user or per download? So great question there.
Really good question. And there's a few different ways that this type of platform, and I won't speak just for Neota, there's different ways that these platforms can be priced. This is a bit of a non-answer, and this is a typical sales speaker answer, but it does really depend on what you want to achieve. Talking about the starting points that we had in this presentation, we will adapt to essentially where you need to start. And that might be that the vision is to do something, try something out, give that a go, and we'll essentially make sure that the price is adapted to the agenda for what you want to deliver. So in that sense, yeah, very keen to have a chat. Please do get in contact, and I'll be really keen to talk about like the agenda that you're hoping to deliver and how we can help.
And if I may, with the second question, Jean, and I just address it to you initially, but Mark, you may have thoughts about this as well. And I'm just going to kind of paraphrase this one, but you know that automation strikes fear in the heart of many lawyers, and I guess a lot of hype around this hasn't helped. You know, the lawyers, you know, will be losing their jobs to robots or whatever you want to put to it. If you're in a situation where folks are, you know, fearful, and you've really got to get some of these automation projects off and running, what can you do to ease them into it, to kind of get them excited about it, for want of a better expression?
Yeah, I think that actually the steps we've recommended will help a long way in that regard too. So you're actually starting with like, what are the problems? You haven't jumped to a solution. You've focused on what are the current problems and the pain points that we've got, and kind of what results do we think we will get from doing this. And kind of, I think if you can go through that, not only the team that's working with it, they should start to feel more comfortable that they're going to be involved in designing something that's actually going to work well and have benefit for them. But you'll also be able to show others, as well, that this is going to work, and actually that the solution that's been identified is going to be one that is actually going to be fit for purpose and that will work. And also, probably just linking back to that question around the cost, also one that will have a strong return on investment. So I think all of the companies involved in the series, they will all price on the basis of value, in the sense that nobody is going to be able to sell a software solution that can't generate a benefit that's many times greater than the cost. And so I think if you've got that bigger picture in mind, it's actually a lot easier to say, well, and nobody wants to automate a document for the legal team to be able to do more meaningful work or something. I mean, that's commonly how automation gets talked about by lawyers, but CFOs don't really care, I would say. But if you're able to kind of put it into a context of like why this is going to work and have benefit, that should also help the individuals to realize that this is not going to be a bad thing for me at all. It's actually going to help me to do sort of a much better job and to do the stuff I want to do.
And you say that, Gene, and it's really important to emphasize what you're saying, because I think it's easy for us to say on a webinar, but it's like our life's work, right? That we're helping people identify, like, as we always say, you can't jump into solution mode. Let's sit with the problem for a bit longer. That is actually incredibly hard in practice to do when you have a burning problem, when you're experiencing this burning problem that you need to solve. So that's why it's really valuable to talk to Gene, or come and talk to Neurologic, come and just send us an email, because we can have that conversation quite generally about just the cadence of things, slowing down and looking at that problem. Because we say it again on this webinar, but the mistake is made every week in corporate world and in law firm world, where people build things that aren't solving a problem and they don't get used. And it's really absolutely critical that we're listening to the right voices, talking to the client, actually going through this process of truly evaluating the ROI on things. Because if the CFO says they want this thing built or automated, and in your heart of hearts that actually isn't going to generate any value, you will fail. Like, you'll build it and you will fail, and it affects your broader agenda. So it does get complicated sometimes in the organization to prioritize and do these things, but we have to do what Gene is saying and sit with the problem for a bit longer and really think through the ROI on these solutions.
Absolutely. And I'm going to add one more point to that, if I may. Please, please, please provide training. From an educator's point of view, you just see so many solutions that are bought. They're fit for purpose, but no one is ever helped with understanding actually how to use it. And then to go to the question that was posed, the fear factor then just explodes, right? Because you don't know how to use it, you don't know what to do with it. So yeah, I'm going to put the plug in there for training as well, if I may. So, folks, sadly, we do have to come to an end, and it is very sad. So thank you very much again, and to everyone who attended. Please do follow the Centre on LinkedIn, Facebook and Twitter, because you'll get announcements about this and a whole bunch of other amazing content that we've got out there. This is episode number 2 of a 7-part series. So you will actually see Gene and Mark back again towards the end of the series, where we're going to have a bit of a chat and a reflection on everything that you've learned here and in others in the series. The 3rd episode is coming up in August, on the 9th of August, at the same time, 1 to 2 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. And it's going to delve into the things that Mark and Gene have kind of highlighted and referred to here on what should I automate, and then choosing the right project. So really going to do a bit more of a deep dive into that as well. And that's going to be with Tom Dreyfus from Joseph, together with his guests, Gary Adler from Minter Ellison and Anna Golovsky from IAG. So do please join us for episode 3 and every episode hereafter. And for this episode, again, Mark and Jean, just an absolute pleasure to have you. Thank you so much, and thank you for your invaluable contribution to this series. We really, really appreciate it.
It's our pleasure, Terry. Thank you very much for making it happen.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.